to speak at our forum. As you know, we have been inviting top scholars from across the globe to talk on important Islamic issues. So in the series of lectures, talks, you are one of these top scholars that we had always wanted to invite. So when I spoke to you last week, you readily agreed, and I'm happy that you chose the topic. I didn't want to impose a topic on you, and we are happy that you chose this topic, and it has generated a very good interest among the people who saw invitation, and a lot of people have joined us already, and a lot of people will be joining in shortly. And as for the participants, I must tell you that for those who don't know Musa Raza Saab, at least people from Chennai will know, but Musa Raza Saab is well known across the globe. In fact, when this invitation went to a friend of mine in Washington, he told me, I have shared a dais, or maybe I was in that meeting where Musa Raza Saab there in Washington recently, and a friend, Mr. Mike Gauss, and he was so happy that, it's an excellent topic for us. Count me in, I'll be there. In fact, he said, I'm going to circulate this across my other friends group, and they have done that. He has done that. So we are hoping that, because it's just morning in America now, it must be around 9:30 in America, so in the morning. So therefore so too early for them, and perhaps people will join in. Maybe Mike himself is resting, or maybe he's just preparing to join in.
Also 9:30 on a Sunday.
Sunday, yeah, not easy. Yeah. So for Musa Raza Saab is an extremely well-known figure. I don't know how to begin, whether to call him a scholar or a bureaucrat or an educationist. I don't know. But then I would start with scholar, because that's how my linkage with him is, my relationship with him is as a scholar. We have been, I know him for at least a couple of decades, and we have been spending lots of time. I have been spending a lot of time in his house, especially in his libraries, sit hours together. Sometimes there were occasions when Musa Raza Saab, I come around 11 o'clock, end up going after dinner. Those were the kind of discussions that I have had with Musa Raza Saab on various issues. We never know, how time passes, in his presence. So therefore, I'm going to introduce him as more of a scholar, as a top scholar of Islam. Not just Islam, he's a polymath, I must say. So he can talk on any subject. You just ask him and he will be there, So he can talk on it. So that's his speciality. In fact, that is greatness. That apart, he has been a very prominent bureaucrat and a Padma Bhushan awardee in 2010, if I'm not wrong. And he was also the principal secretary to the Chief Minister of Gujarat, and then he was Chief Secretary of Jammu and Kashmir, and then he was also the advisor to the Uttar Pradesh governor at a time when the Babri Masjid was demolished, and he was there in the thick of things when the demolition was happening, and he was mainly responsible at that time for controlling the riots in those areas. And these are all behind the scenes information, or unknown information so far. Like the Quran says, "Zalika min amba'il ghaibi." No, like I'm telling the listeners that these are things which may not know. Your role in controlling those riots, and the role that you played behind the scenes when you were in Uttar Pradesh. And that apart, Musa Raza Saab is an author of several books. One of the best books that I have read is it's called In Search of Oneness, wherein it tries to combine the spiritual knowledge of Islam, Christianity, and basically Hinduism, Sufi thought, and how people can be united, how people are one, basically. So that was an excellent book, which he wrote, was published by the Penguins in 2011 or 12. And then he penned that wonderful translation of Ghalib's Persian poetry into Urdu and English, both, right, Musa Raza Saab?
Yeah, correct.
Yeah. And then after that, recently is
now in Tamil also.
Oh, in Tamil also. Okay, yes. Wonderful. And then the other book was the recent book was on Kashmir. So that also generated a lot of discussion. That was just the time when the 370 article was being discussed, and in fact, it was subsequently removed, and that generated a lot of debates. He was interviewed by NDTV, and maybe Barkha Dutt separately also interviewed him on that. And there was a review of it in several papers, and also an interview in major newspapers. That book generated a lot of discussion in the media. So Mr. Musara, as I said, he's a kind of polymath. I mean, he dabbles in almost every subject under the sun, in a sense. So I'm not exaggerating, because I'm telling this from my personal experience, and I'm perhaps one of the few people in Chennai who has been in such close contact with him for more than 15 years at least, in my opinion. So therefore, it gives me immense pleasure in not just inviting Musara Sahab here, but also letting the participants know that that they are certainly in for a wonderful discussion on this subject. And we should, of course, Ms. Musara Sahab may speak for about 45 minutes. Musara Sahab, will that be enough? 45 minutes
I will try to speak
for half an hour? Or?
on the subject, maybe half an hour, maybe 40
Okay.
minutes. I don't know.
Okay. Maybe anywhere between 30 and 40 minutes. And then we open up for another hour of discussion. So it's going to be a freewheeling discussion, and people can ask any kind of question related to the topic. And I'm sure Musara Sahab will be very happy to answer you. So thank you so much, participants, and as well as Musara Sahab, for being here. Over to you, Musara Sahab.
Thank you very much, Faiz. In fact, I am very, very glad to be joining this discussion when participants from across the globe.
We have 37 now.
Oh my God, number has gone up.
Yeah, it was 20 or 25 something when I started the introduction. It's 37 already.
Very good, very good. I'm glad to be addressing 37, 40 participants across the globe. Yeah. And I am grateful to you also, Faiz, for having invited me to come and speak to this particular forum. I know that at one point of time when we were establishing this forum, you wanted me to be the chairman. Yeah. But I was too busy at that point of time to accept your invitation. And now you have been doing a very, very able management of this forum. And I noticed that you are regularly holding webinars. That is the word nowadays current.
Yes.
On various kinds of subjects, and you are persuading people, scholars from all across the globe, to come and speak on your forum. So I am grateful to be invited to address these 37 or 40 participants who are listening to me, I'm sure.
Yeah. In fact, just to interject for a minute, Musara Sahab, of course, at that time you had your commitment, you couldn't be our president of a forum, but nevertheless, you are one of our advisors. In our deed, you are one of the advisors, and we value that. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
And you have been advising us very well all these years. We are benefiting your advice.
Now, let me start whatever I am going to say by making it very clear right at the beginning that I am neither a faqih, that means I am not going to speak on the fiqh part of the subject. I am not a muhtasib who is a inspector of morals. Neither am I a mudarris, a teacher. I am quoting a Urdu couplet, my translation of what the very famous Persian poet wrote long back. Muhtasib hu, na main qazi, na mudarris, na faqih, mujhko kya kaam ke main kharo se paikar karu. Meaning thereby, I am neither an inspector of morals, nor am I a professor of religion, nor am I a jurist, nor am I a judge. Why should I enter into a controversy? Why should I enter into a war with people who want to drink? So this is what very, very famous Persian poet, the national poet of Iran, wrote long ago. Now, therefore, with that introduction of mine, that you have introduced me as a scholar. Well, I would rather call myself a student rather than a scholar, because the provocation for what I am now going to speak was given by my daughter, Ghazala, who happens to be at the moment in Canada. I don't know whether she has yet joined the discussion or not yet. She has not yet joined. Okay.
I have not. I don't see an. Yeah.
Hopefully, she should also join. See, what happened was Ghazala got admitted into a college in London, Goldsmith College, for media studies. Before leaving for UK, she asked me, since I am going to be in a hostel, Daddy, please let me know what I can and what I should not eat. Now, at that point of time, my knowledge of halal and haram was rather limited. So I told her that as far as I am aware of, the Quran prohibits you from eating pork. So that is absolutely out. You cannot eat in any form blood. That is also absolutely out. You cannot eat. Hello? Somebody is there?
No, no,
You
no.
cannot.
I think your voice is echoing somewhere.
Now you cannot eat maita, that is carrion, any animal that has been killed through a natural process by either falling from a height or being gored to death by a wild animal or and died of other natural causes. You cannot eat that meat, and you cannot eat anything which has been dedicated to other than God, to particularly idols and so on. So I advise that these are the four things which the Quran very clearly prohibits you from eating. Quran also asks you to avoid drinking, so avoid any alcoholic drink. And beyond this, Quran also permits you to eat what Christians and Jews, Ahle Kitab, that is people of the book, have slaughtered. That is halal for you. That means in your hostel, I'm sure, meat that is served would be meat which has been slaughtered by Ahle Kitab only, that is Christians and Jews. So therefore you are permitted to eat meat of the Ahle Kitab because verse 5 of chapter 5, Maida, Surah Maida very clearly says, Uhilla lakumut tayyabat, all clean things are permitted to you. Uhilla lakumut tayyabat wa ta'amal lazina utul kitab, that is the food of those who have been given the book, which means at that point of time, mainly the Christians and the Jews, and also amongst the Ahle Kitab subsequently, Sabain, that is the people from Haran, a sector also included. So therefore, these are people whose slaughtered animal, slaughtered by them, are permissible to you. So you can go ahead and eat them. Beyond this, you are free. I mean, it all depends upon your taste and your inclination, and all fish is permitted to you. There is no restriction on that because, again, the Quran very clearly says that Uhilla lakumus saidul bahar, that means the shikar, the hunting of the sea. And God was very, very wise, and it is God's wisdom that He did not use the word samak. Samak is the Arabic word for fish. If He had used samak, then there would have been a restriction on what you are going to eat. And therefore, Allah in His wisdom used the word Saidul Bahar, that is a hunt of the sea, shikar of the sea. Which means that anything that comes out of the sea is halal for you. It means fish, it means whales, it means eels, it means sea animals, all sea products. Anything that mollusks and prawns and shrimp and so on, they are all permissible unto you. Therefore, you can go ahead and eat any of the things that come out of the sea. Now, I advise these things to her. She went to to Goldsmith College in the University of London. And 3 months later, she writes to me, because in those days we didn't have WhatsApp and so on. So our communication was still by paper. This was in the early 90s, I'm talking, before the invention of the mobile telephony. So she wrote to me enclosing a pamphlet by Maududi, Allama Maududi of the famous Jamaat Islami, a very small pamphlet running into some 40, 50 pages. And therein he had said that don't eat, avoid eating anything slaughtered by the people of the book. She got worried. She said that you permitted me to eat what is slaughtered by the people of the book. In my hostel, only what is slaughtered by Christians and Jews is available. And now Maududi Sahab says that I cannot eat that. Then what do I eat except fish and eggs? I cannot subsist on only fish and eggs all throughout my 3 years of stay in the college. Now I got a little worried. So she told me, she said, please go and let me have your considered advice on this pamphlet which I am enclosing. She enclosed the pamphlet also. I went through the pamphlet carefully. Now, I personally believe that Maududi Sahib is a great scholar, but he was led astray as far as that particular pamphlet is concerned, because he has criticized even a man like Hazrat Ibn Abbas, the cousin of the Prophet, and one of his closest Sahabis, and who was called Ibrul Islam. That means he was considered the rabbi of Islam. He was such a great scholar. And he says, no, don't go by what Ibn Abbas has said. I am saying that you should avoid. Now, I thought that Maududi Sahib cannot place himself above Ibn Abbas. Ibn Abbas, as I mentioned, was the son of Hazrat Abbas, who was the uncle of the Prophet. And when he was born, Hazrat Abbas brought him to the Prophet, and the Prophet put his finger in his mouth. It is reported in the Hadith. Put his finger in his mouth and put it in the mouth of Ibn Abbas. Now, that was a great act on the part of the Prophet, which gave Ibn Abbas great knowledge. He was a man who learned Arabic poetry, Arabic prose. He studied religion and so on and so forth. And he has very clearly stated that you can eat. This is in his tafsir, and subsequently also in the Ahadith books, where he says that you can eat what has been slaughtered by the people of the book. So therefore, Maududi Sahib placed himself above Ibn Abbas and criticized Ibn Abbas. That is why I use the word that he has been sort of led astray in placing himself at that level. So anyway, I decided that since Maududi Sahib has written so authoritatively a pamphlet where he has advised that people should not eat what has been slaughtered by the people of the book, I thought I should make a detailed study of the subject. So what I did was I went to the earliest tafsir, the tafsir of Tabri, tafsir of Baidawi, tafsir of Zamakhshari, tafsir of I don't recall, at least a dozen tafsirs of the earliest Mufassirin I went through. Then I went through the second generation Mufassirin, like the famous one, Jalalain, the famous Jalalain. I went through Jalalain. Then I went through subsequent Mufassirin, and right down to Shabbir Ahmad Usmani of Pakistan, who was considered himself a great Islamic scholar. Now, except Jalalain, where again he was a little bit pro-Maududi kind of approach, All the other Mufassirin have very clearly stated that you can eat the animals slaughtered by the people of the book. Anyway, now coming back to the point, after having studied the various tafasir by all these great people, then I went through all the ahadith collections. I went through Bukhari, I went through Tirmizi, I went through the Sihah Sitta completely, and all the ahadith referring to this particular subject. And then I went through the commentaries, like including Fatahul Bari by Ibn Hajar Asqalani. So I went through a complete set of all the ahadith at that time on this subject. Then I went through because many of them said that the people of the book which the Prophet permitted were those who were there at that point of time in Arabia. They were slaughtering their animals under the name of God. Therefore, it was halal there. Today, the people of the book don't do it. Now, that was a news to me. So I decided to read and study what do the people of the book do today? How do they behave? What do they do in the slaughter? Now I discovered, and I went to Sekita, all the complete Jewish Talmud. I have, in fact, back of my room where I'm sitting, I have got all the 8 volumes of the Talmud, 9 volumes of the Mishnah, the Jewish law, the book of Tahara. Then I have got encyclopedia of Christianity, which gives a complete details about the early Christians and what they ate and what they did not eat. I went through all these things. It took me 3 months, even though I was still employed. In the night, I used to study all these books. Now, I came to the conclusion after reading all these books that the people of the book whom the Quran refers to in Surah Ma'idah, أُحِلَّ لَكُمُ الطَّيِّبَاتُ وَطَعَامَ الَّذِينَ أُوتُوا الْكِتَابَ. Now, who are those people of the book and what did they do at that point of time? I discovered that the earliest sect of Christians were known as the Ebionites. The Ebionites were those who believed in Christ and who were the followers of Saint Peter and Saint Matthew and the earliest 12 apostles of Jesus Christ. Now, these Ebionites followed all the Jewish laws because Jesus Christ himself in Matthew chapter 12, if I recall, very clearly stated that I have not come to abrogate the law. I have come to establish the law. And anyone who avoids, who breaches even a tittle of the law will not be getting his salvation. That means Jesus Christ reaffirmed in the Bible, in the New Testament, he reaffirmed the Jewish laws of halal and haram. And there was in the Acts, which is the 5th volume of the New Testament. Please, Krishnara warned me if I'm exceeding my time. He's given me 45 minutes. I should not exceed that time.
No, you can please go ahead, Musarasa. The people are very interested. We have 47 now participants, so people are interested. You can go ahead.
Because I was talking of the Ebionites.
Yeah.
The Ebionites were the earliest Christians, and they were Jews who got converted to Christianity. And they followed all the laws of Moses, all the laws of the Old Testament. They never ate pork. They never ate blood. They never ate any animal slaughtered in the name of other than God, and so on. So they followed all the laws of Moses, which are given in Leviticus and which are given in the Old Testament. Deuteronomy and Leviticus are the 2 books which contain the laws which govern the dietary habits of the Jews. So Jesus Christ himself followed all those laws. He never ate any pig, for example. In fact, if you read the New Testament, you will notice that he has condemned uh, pigs, has condemned swine. And so much so that an English saying has come down, saying casting pearls before the swine. Seeing that the condemnatory note of the swine is there even in that saying. Anyway, coming back to this point, the earliest Ebionites followed all the laws. But once Saint Paul came into the picture, and as you know, Saint Paul was not an early Christian. He did not belong to the Habbarim. He didn't belong to the 12 disciples of Jesus Christ. He was in fact a persecutor of Christianity. It is also mentioned somewhere that he participated in the stoning of one of the famous followers of Christ, one of the 12 followers of Christ, namely Saint Stephen. So when Saint Stephen was stoned to death, Paul was present in that group. This is what subsequent research says. And this man heard that some people were getting converted to Christianity in Damascus. So he took permission from the highest Jewish body, Sanhedrin. He said, I want to go to Damascus and to persecute the Christians who are getting, Jews who are getting converted to Christianity. He was permitted and he was traveling. And on the Golan Heights, which fall between Palestine and Syria, it is said, according to him and according to subsequent authors, that he found a man traveling with him who turned out to be Christ after his crucifixion. So after the crucifixion of Christ, it was Christ who traveled with Paul and asked him, why are you persecuting me? Why are you harassing my followers? And that brought about a complete reversal of St. Peter's approach to the Christians. He became a Christian himself. He lost his eyesight at that point of time. He lost his power of speech for some time. So when he reached Damascus, he became a Christian. And he started preaching a new form of Christianity because of his experience on the Golan Heights, where, according to him, Jesus Christ appeared and asked him, "Quo vadis, where art thou going?" So from there, he said, I must preach Christianity not only to the Jews, but to the Gentiles, that means non-Jews, the Romans who were occupying in Damascus. So when they all became, many of them became Christians, they had a problem. They said, we are all grown-up people, we cannot get ourselves circumcised, and we cannot give up eating pork because that is a major food source, protein source for us, and so on. So St. Paul said that to the pure, everything is pure, you can go ahead and eat. He permitted them to eat pork, he permitted them to give them full freedom to, but so long as you accepted Jesus Christ as God, Son of God, then you are assured of your salvation. You accept Jesus Christ as your Savior, and your future is assured as far as your salvation is concerned. When this news came back to Jerusalem, Saint Peter and the original Habbarim, original followers of Jesus Christ, got extremely upset. He said, this man is going and preaching something which is not there in our books. We are all, and these were the Ebionites. So Peter was, Paul was summoned back to Jerusalem, and there was a very big debate whether he should be permitted to go and teach this kind of Christianity to the Christians. So a compromise is ultimately struck between. He said that if you stick to the law, the law of Moses, then Christianity will remain only amongst the Abionites. This was Paul's argument. So he said, if I am going to bring the Gentiles into Christianity, we have to make certain concessions. And these were the concessions. So a certain compromise was struck between Peter and his group, and at that point of time, the younger brother of Jesus Christ, James, was heading the Christian community. James also agreed. James and Peter, they all agreed to make certain compromises. They said, okay, you don't have to do circumcision. You may eat pork. Don't eat blood. That is not good for us. And don't eat anything which is sacrificed before the idols. So with these minimal restrictions, the compromise was permitted to St. Paul. And he went and preached Christianity. And today, everybody says that it was St. Paul who converted the rest of the world, because he went to Damascus, he went to Edessa, he went to Antioch, he went to Ephesus, and so on. He converted all of these Gentiles to Christianity. The result was that Pauline Christianity became the dominant Christianity, and the Ebionites became a small sect confined to only Jerusalem. Slowly, the Ebionites vanished. They were persecuted subsequently, and those who followed the Mosaic law amongst the Christians were not considered to be a very good example to the rest of the Christians. So therefore, the Ebionites vanished, and by the 4th century, there are hardly any mention of Ebionites in the historic books. Even in the Encyclopedia of Christianity, you will find under Ebionites that by the 4th century, they had ceased to be a force in the religious world. It was Paul's Christianity which became the dominant Christianity. And today, when the Quran was revealed in the 6th century, 610, the ruling Christian community at that time, both outside Arabia and inside Arabia, was the Pauline Christianity. It was not the Ebionite Christianity. Therefore, when the Quran says, it means reference is to these Christians, the Christians who believed in Paul, not Christians who believed in the Ebionite philosophy. Therefore, the argument of Jalalain that the Christians of that time followed this, that, and the other is a completely bogus argument, because there is no historic evidence that when the Quran refers to Ahl al-Kitab, it refers only to those original Christians. They were not there. By 4th century, they had ceased to exist. Anyway, coming back to today's position, what is the position today? Today, the halal industry in the world, and perhaps this may come as a surprise to many of my listeners here, it is $1.7 or $1.75 trillion, trillion, not billion, 1.75 trillion dollars, and by 2021 it is poised to increase to more than $2 trillion. So when I am talking about halal and haram, I do not want to enter into a situation where this entire huge industry becomes my enemy. I don't want to take any, unke saath panga nahi lena hai. I don't want to enter into a battle with these people, because they have become now the guardians of the halal industry. Now, the halal industry today includes not only meat, not only animal slaughter, it also includes so many other items. For example, all your creams which women apply to face, are those creams halal? Do they have gelatin, for example? Gelatin is halal or haram. So people have now gone down to that level where you are talking about beauty products and talking about biscuits and talking about toothpaste. And so all these items have now become halal and haram. You have to start examining whether this is halal, this is haram, this is halal, this is haram. Now, why is it this industry has grown to such an extent, and how did it happen? It happened in the West particularly, because I am making a distinction between the West and our Indian subcontinent. I am talking about Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, Malaysia, and so on. There is a distinction. We eat our meat, particularly from the corner butcher shop. We walk across to the butcher shop and we buy our meat from there. We don't want, we don't, go. But in the West, there is no corner butcher shop. Most of the food comes in the form of processed products, you know. If you go to Carrefour, if you go to Walmart, you will get roast chicken, which is already slaughtered and taken out from some frozen storage and converted into a roast chicken. So therefore, we don't know in the West what is the position. In the East, in India, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, we know that this meat which is being sold by the corner grocer shop, butcher shop, is halal, because he has brought it from the abattoir where there are regular slaughtering being done in the halal manner. Now, we don't know anything in the West what is happening. Last 30 years particularly, especially when the diaspora started, when the younger people went from the East to the West, either as students or in search of jobs and so on, Muslims from Pakistan, from North Africa, from India, from Bangladesh, from Malaysia, Indonesia, all the Muslims who went from these countries, including India, of course, all the Muslims who went from here, when they went to America, when they went to Europe, they were finding themselves disoriented. They were not a part of that community. Therefore, they all gathered together in a diaspora. They were not, in fact, you would notice that if you go to America or you go to Canada or you go to Europe, the Indians and Pakistanis and the Indonesian Muslims all gathered together. Whereas in India, you don't have any such Muslims, Pakistanis and Bangladesh together. We still consider a distance between ourselves and these countries. They are very friendly. The Pakistani and the Indians and the Indonesians and the Bangladeshis, they all live together in a particular area, in a particular, you may call it ghetto if you want to call it, but it is a sort of an enclave. Now, as a result of their coming together in these areas, and as a result of the Western people looking at them as different from themselves, these people in the diaspora, they start thinking of themselves as Muslims, not as Bangladeshi, not as Indian, not as Pakistani, but as a Muslim. Now, how do you determine, how do you show that you are a Muslim? You show either through a dress, put a hijab, put a burqa, and grow a beard, and eat halal food. So therefore, this is a reaction. This is a reaction to the disorientation, reaction to the Western milieu, Western society's rejection of these people. Not consciously, but subconsciously, unconsciously, they have not yet assimilated these people into their societies. God knows whether it is going to happen or not happen. But the way the halal concept is increasing in the West, it may take a very long time, because, as I mentioned, the halal industry is growing at the rate of 9% per annum in the West, globally. Therefore, 9% is a very high percentage for the growth of the halal industry in the West. Now, a 2 trillion industry. Suddenly, most of the foreign companies, the multinationals, are woken up. They said, my God, there is a lot of profit available to us in this industry, in the halal industry. Therefore, whether it is Nestle, whether it is Cadbury, whether it is Domino's, whether it is almost all you give the big names of the food industry in the West, they are all into now the halal concept. So you will discover that you have got halal Domino's and halal uh, shops and halal this, halal pizza and so on. So the big industry now has got a vested interest. All the large industry, the Western large industries, have developed a vested interest in the growth of the halal food concept in the West. Once these people are now into the picture, I don't think that the halal industry is going to die down in the near future. It is going to grow at 9%. It may even grow at 10, 12, 13% in the coming years. So the halal industry, what does it mean today in Europe, in America? Halal, let me talk only about animals first. Halal animal is some animal which, according to the Islamic law, has been properly slaughtered. What is the meaning of properly slaughtered? The Quran itself mentions, I think, 4 ways of performing halal. What is that? One is tazkiyah. Tazkiyah means zabiha. That means that you slaughter an animal by cutting its trachea, that is the windpipe, and the 2 carotid arteries which are going on both sides of the trachea. If you cut these 3 blood supply and air supply vessels, and the animal is allowed to die, that is called, animal is called halal. This applies to both large animals as well as to chicken and other birds and so on and so forth. This is one form. Then you have got another form which is mentioned in the Quran, and that is nahar. Nahar. What is nahar? Nahar is what is referred to in the Quran. Inna a'tayna kal kawsar fasalli li rabbika wanhar inna shaniyaka huwal abtar. One har. What is that one har? That is nahar. Nahar means large animals like camel, for example. You can't slaughter a camel by dragging it down to the ground, holding its legs and so on without injury to the person who's slaughtering. So the slaughtered's life is endangered when he is slaughtering a wild, a large cow or a large bull or a large camel. So you perform not sabiha, you perform nahar. Nahar means you make it stand up, tie it down or whatever, and take a very sharp weapon. Either it could be a knife or it could be a sword or whatever, and with that you cut its neck. Allow it to bleed. And once it bleeds and it falls down, then of course after the blood has been removed, it becomes halal. That is called nahar. There is a reference also to a third method, which I think our subsequent faqis have not agreed to. It is called naqa, noon, ain. Naqa. Naqa means you kill an animal by one single stroke from the back. For example, a chicken, you put the head there, down below, neck, and cut it. The head becomes separated. That's also halal, according to the practice that was followed during the time of the Prophet. These were the methods which were adopted at that point of time for halal. Now, today, what is the position? Are the animals which are being sold? We can be sure that in India or in Pakistan, animals are being slaughtered in the old Tazkiyah Zabiha fashion, where the sheep or the goat is put down on the ground and with a sharp knife it is cut. Is it being done in America? Is it being done in New York? Is it being done in Chicago? Very big question mark, because there the meat comes from the large factories, huge factories where in a day some 20,000 animals are slaughtered. How did that happen? There was a movement which started in both Europe and in America against slaughtering animals in this tazkiya fashion or zabiha fashion, which gave a lot of pain to the animal. Therefore, to ensure that animals do not suffer, you have to stun them before you slaughter them. So they discovered this. They invented different kinds of pistols. Now, one kind of pistol that has a bolt. So you keep it on the head of the animal, on its forehead, and you stun. You press the button, and a bolt goes and strikes with a great force on the head of the animal, and the animal gets stunned. Once it is stunned, of course, it is hung from the roof and so on, and it is slaughtered by somebody standing at the other end. Like a assembly line, it goes. Now, there is another kind of stunning where the bolt goes into the brain and kills the animal. Now, that method, one method is stunning without going into the brain, and the other method is just going into the brain and killing. The third method, which they use a lot, is electrification, solid shock. Give a shock to the animal, and the animal gets stunned. Then you do this slaughtering. So this is methodology. What do the faqihs say about this stunning? Most of the faqihs in America, in Europe, they have agreed that so long as the stunning is done without killing the animal, that the animal still is alive when it is being slaughtered, then it is halal. If it is done by a kitabi, if it is done by a people of the book, Ahl al-Kitab. If a Ahl al-Kitab is performing the slaughter through this method of stunning the animal, then the animal is halal. But if the animal dies when it comes before the slaughterer, then it is haram, because it becomes maita, it becomes carrier. This is the most of the faqihs in all the four religions have given this fatwa in America, in Europe, in many places. The other day, very interestingly, I was reading a fatwa by no less a person. Please correct me, one of the persons who are sitting around should be able to correct me if I am wrong. By no less a person than Uthaymin. Uthaymin is the successor to bin Bas in Saudi Arabia, a great faqih himself, and who is highly respected by the Saudi Arabian Muslims. Now, he was asked that we get, when we go to Europe or to America, we get this Domino's pizza or Pizza Hut pizza, which contains meat and chicken. We don't know whether it is halal or haram. So what do we do? Should we eat it or should we not eat it? Allama Uthaymin has very clearly stated, if you know personally of your own knowledge that this meat which is on the pizza has not been slaughtered by a people of the book, or it is not been, your personal knowledge should be there. If your personal knowledge is there that this is haram, then don't eat it. But if you have no knowledge, then under this law, that means the food of the people of the book has been made halal for you. Therefore, a pizza which is coming before you is a part of the food of the people of the book. Therefore, you can eat it by saying Bismillah, start eating, there is no problem. Now, I was a little surprised because a man like Allama Uthaymin is becoming so liberal as to permit the eating of a pizza about whom the eater does not know whether it is
Domino's halal. Halal nahi. खुद उन्हें बोलता कि it is
कौन
not
बोलता?
halal. Domino's.
If he's saying clearly, no, my wife is correcting me that the pizza which is supplied by Domino's is haram because he himself is saying that it is haram. If he is saying it is haram, then don't eat it. You are not supposed to. But if he does not say so, if it is from the Pizza Hut, for example, and no haram or halal has been mentioned about it, then you have to know whether it is actually coming from a haram source and your knowledge is there. Then, of course, you cannot eat it, it becomes haram. Otherwise, it remains halal. This is what I think Uthaymin has said. I saw this in the internet. Now, as I mentioned right at the beginning, thank you very much for correcting me, madam. My wife corrected me about Domino's. Now, coming back to this haram and halal, what do the Muslims who have gone to work in Western countries, how do they adapt themselves, or adopt the mores and the customs of the rest of the community to become a part of the community? That is a question before them. I don't think that for the coming several decades, many of the Muslims from various countries who have gone abroad, who have gone to Europe, America, and other countries are going to easily get acclimatized to the mores of the Western world. The question also has come up now. For example, the Quran permits you, has made it halal for you in the same surah Al-Ma'idah, that you can marry the chaste women of the people of the book. Chaste women. Now, chaste women would mean women who have, I don't know what is the translation for the word chaste. You understand what I mean by chaste. So chaste women of the people of the book are permitted for Muslims to marry. Now the question is whether a Muslim can marry a Christian woman, he can marry a Jewish woman. Is it permissible for him or not? There is a very big debate going on in both America and Europe. And there are many muftis who are saying that it is not permitted for you to marry. Even though the Quran itself is very clearly saying that you are permitted to marry chaste women from amongst the people of the book. Why? Because it appears that Hazrat Umar, during his caliphate, heard that in Yemen, one of the governors had married a Christian lady. He wrote to that governor and ordered him immediately to divorce that woman. Now, many of the subsequent faqihs have tried to justify this action of Hazrat Umar, prohibiting the man from marrying a Christian woman. Why? Because according to their logic, this permission of the Quran applies only to the Christian and the Jewish women of Medina and Arabia. Why? Because in Medina, the majority were Muslims and minority were Christians and Jews. If a Jewish or a Christian woman married a Muslim, the children would still remain Muslims. The possibility of those children getting converted to Christianity is not there. Whereas in a place like Najran or a place like Yemen, where Christianity was majority at that point of time, there was a danger that the children born of the marriage of a Muslim man and a Christian woman, the Christian woman was likely to take the children to the church when she went for her prayers in the on Sunday or whatever and convert them to Christianity. That is why Hazrat Umar prohibited Muslim men from marrying Christian women in non-Muslim, non-Christian majority area. He didn't give the justification. He didn't say that this is a Christian majority area or whatever. He simply said, immediately divorce that lady under orders of punishment. So the man had to divorce his wife, and he wrote subsequently saying that the Quran has permitted me. Umar said that Quran has permitted you, but those are under different circumstances. Those circumstances do not prevail at the moment. Therefore, you cannot marry. Now, I am mentioning this as an example of the issues that are coming up now. To what extent is halal and haram going to remain relevant for the Muslims? My own personal opinion, after having read about all these things, is that for coming many years to come, the concept of halal food, halal cosmetics and halal toothpaste is going to become even more stringent. Most of the reasons for that is the attitude of the West to the Muslims, the phobia, Islamophobia, which is taking place in the West, as a result of which Muslims are becoming more and more mentally ghettoized, even if they are not physically ghettoized, mentally ghettoized. This reaction, this reason why they want to go for halal food and halal clothes, and now God has himself by COVID has ordered that every person, whether he is a Muslim or a Christian, has got to wear a hijab. So he's made it compulsory. I don't know for how long that hijab will remain. And even when that hijab is removed, Muslims are going to remain under a Islamophobia atmosphere, and they are going to react. This is my personal opinion. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, you have ended, Musarasa.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Oh, that was a absolutely fascinating discussion, Musarasa. You know, you spent 1 hour on that, and we didn't realize it was 1 hour. So
I didn't know.
almost 1 hour. You know, nobody realized it was 1 hour. I was still thinking that you must have clocked only 30 minutes, but you have clocked 60 minutes, and it's absolutely fascinating that, you know. In fact, when you were talking about the Ebionites and said that they were by the 4th century, you were right, because in 325 AD, in the Council of Nicaea, all other forms of versions of Christianity was finished by Emperor Constantine, who was a recent convert to Christianity. In the Council of Nicaea, he said and burned.
Actually, he was not converted to Christianity in the Council of Nicaea.
No, he came before that. He became Christian before that, right?
He never got converted. According to the latest research, never got converted.
Oh, acha, I know that.
Yeah, he was sympathetic, but never got converted.
But it was in that council that all other gospels, including the gospel of the Ebionites, there was a gospel of the Ebionites in which spoke about Jesus as only a Messiah, not a divine God. You know, it just spoke about Jesus as a Messiah, and even Trinity was absent from their gospel. So these gospels were completely thrown or burnt, and people who believed in those gospels were said that you know, they were heretics and burnt or killed. So that's how it was institutionalized. The present Christianity, the Pauline Christianity, as you rightly called it, was institutionalized at that time, the 4th century. And absolutely, you're right that, you know, in that it was this Christianity, Pauline, which the Quran refers to in the Quran itself. That's why the Quran condemns Trinity, and it condemns the divinity of Christ, with due respect to our Christian brothers, because we have a pastor also here in this discussion, Musarasa Sahab. We have a Christian pastor, a Jesuit pastor. Yeah. So therefore, in fact, also I'm sure you would have been aware, Musarasa Sahab, in Nassim Nicholas Taleb, in one of his books, if I'm not wrong, it is Anti-Fragile. he talks about the dictatorship of the minority. His thesis about the halal industry is that it is the dictatorship of the minority, and the more intolerant the minority, the more its what you call dictatorship gets imposed. Because he gives an example: a person who does not believe in halal or haram won't mind eating a halal product, but a person, even if he's a small minority, does not believe in strictly follows the halal concept. So the industry will have to create something for not to leave these fellows out, otherwise that's not good business. So therefore it is the small minority which dictates terms. The more intolerant they are, the more the terms gets imposed. So he is a very, and what the term uses, dictatorship of the minority. That's something interesting that I'm sure you would have.
Yeah, I read the book.
Yeah. So this is apart from the industry, the 2 trillion industry, that's mind-boggling actually. So,
I didn't know when I learned that it is almost 2 trillion today. Huh?
yeah, and growing at 9% every year.
Yeah.
That's a phenomenal growth, you know. No wonder. I think this is one area where the Islamophobes don't mind imposing halal.
Because they make it money out.
Yeah, true. So
Yeah.